Here we're just going to briefly touch upon the idea of the symbolic world of the New Testament. Of course, we need to think more about this idea of symbols and the major symbols that dominated in the first century world. Because you want to ask, well, what do we mean in the first place by symbols? Of course, a symbol is where something represents something that represents some other thing. So, if you have a ring on your finger, then that's a symbol that you are married, or it could be. Or you could have the idea of a sticker on your car. Could be a symbol or a sign that you have a kind of registration for that car, or that you promote or are supportive of the organization that may be indicated or represented by that symbol. Or a tattoo can be a symbol of some kind of love or affection or interest that the person has. So anything can represent some other thing, and can be symbols. But symbols always have their meaning that are defined by the context of their use. So something that may be a symbol, one symbol in one culture, may not have the same meaning in another culture. And so if you think about the ways in which cultures can kind of change a symbol, we think of the apple as a symbol. Someone might say, well, an apple might symbol Adam and Eve, eating a forbidden fruit in the garden. So that can be something that is a symbol of disobedience. Or somebody might think of an apple and think of, the Apple company. I'm not be thinking at all anything about Adam or Eve. Or somebody might think of the apple and may think of apple falling on top of Isaac Newton's head and thinking about gravity. Or an apple might be associated with something you give to a teacher to tell a teacher how much you appreciate them. So apples can have lots of different symbolisms depending upon who's using them and in what context, what cultural context that they are utilized. Well, when you look at Second Temple Judaism, there are obviously lots of symbols that they have, and some of the major symbols certainly is the temple is a symbol of God's presence with his people. And so that was what was so devastating when the temple was destroyed, is that was a sign of God's judgment against his people. That as long as the temple stood, God was with them. If God permits an occupying force to come and destroy the temple, that is an indication that God has abandoned the temple. He no longer associates himself with the temple, and therefore he is no longer present with his people in that particular way. Now, of course, when Jews knew that their temple was destroyed, they didn't think that God was gone. They knew that he was still there. But the very special relationship that he had with them, where his kind of glory is present physically with his people, was gone. And so the desire to have a temple be revealed as this symbol of God's glory, presence, the term that is sometimes used, Shekinah, was desired. Wanted to once again see that was there. Circumcision was also a symbol of one's identity with the Jewish people. Now, Jews were not the only people who practiced circumcision. Other people did, but Jews saw circumcision as a sign that this person, males, belonged to the covenant people. And if a Jew refused to be circumcised, or in some cases even reversed their circumcision, then that was kind of like a repudiation of their identity as God's people, or a repudiation of the law according to other Jews. Sabbath is a symbol that takes people back to the idea of God's resting on his last day of creation, and also the desire for some kind of rest for people. But it's also, again, an identity marker for Jews. Only Jews practiced the Sabbath. And so if one didn't observe the Sabbath, then there was this kind of it was a sign of rejecting a symbol of what it means to be a Jew. One could be then seen by other Jews as a disobedient or an unlawful Jew. So these are some of the major symbols that existed, and attacking these symbols or addressing these symbols or disregarding these symbols, was treated by several Jews with a great deal of seriousness. Battles had been fought in order to be able to preserve these symbols. There are also major symbols in the Greco-Roman world. We're not going to go into all those symbols, but you'll pick up these symbols as you go through De Silva. But simply, some of the symbols that are quite common were coins. So, you don't have to have coins in order to do business with people. You can go into a barter system where you change goods for other goods. But currency, monetization, was one way of trying to control economy. And oftentimes on coins, Roman coins, would be the face of the Roman emperor, just like, very oftentimes currencies today may have the face of a figure, political figure, on them. And that's kind of to indicate something of the power of the economy, who's in charge. Coins in the ancient world were kind of like billboards. It promoted the idea of who's in charge, who's responsible, who you're honoring in the system that you're participating in, particularly the economic system. So, but one of the things that occurred, like if you were a Jew and you had coins with the face of the Roman emperor on it, and you decided to go to the temple, well, there's a law that says, "Thou shalt have no graven images before me," and so Jews did not want the image of the emperor brought in as currency into the temple, and so you had to have money changers, and money changers then would swap out a coin with an emperor for a temple coin. And these temple coins did not have images of emperors or people's faces on it, but it would have images that are agricultural based. So coins were a big symbol. Banners was a huge symbols. Oftentimes, because banners would once again have the faces of the emperors on them, once again indicating the power of the Roman might. And so Romans would put banners in places where they wanted to show their dominance in areas. So lots of symbols are used, and so sometimes it's important to kind of be aware or alert. So we see symbols in Christianity. Baptism is a symbol, Lord's Supper is a symbol, church buildings can be symbols. But also other kinds of practices can be symbolic of other things, and avoidance of certain practices can be symbolic of other things. Just as a brief one other point here about symbols is the idea of holiness and purity. Holiness and purity themselves, although they are abstract terms, they're not physical items, they themselves are symbols. Holiness and purity then were issues of national identity and security. And so when you are holy, set apart, distinct, unique, you indicate who you are. And when you seek purity, whether this is ceremonial purity, ceremonial cleanliness, moral purity, sexual purity, you're indicating something that if this is done, then these things will happen, or these things will be true about you. Holiness, defining what's invested with the power to approach God. So if the scrolls are holy, these scrolls somehow or another allow you to approach God. If the temple is holy, the temple is something that allows you to approach God. If food has been blessed and food becomes holy, then this is food then that is acceptable to eat as one seeks to draw near to God or seek to be in a relationship with God, a proper relationship with God. So we find this holiness in the temple. It's a place where Jews could participate in God's holiness through the Levitical liturgy, filled with different symbols, and it's regulated by a calendar. And calendar itself can be a symbol of time and a regulation of time. Its layout, its different courts, then identify the different degrees of holiness that a person could acquire. Holiness could be experienced in synagogues. There are liturgies through prayers and blessings when the recitation of the Shema, that is, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. By reciting that, people are symbolizing again their identity as the people who hear the word of the Lord of the God, who observe the word of the Lord of God. It is a symbolic act of indicating the community's identity. So the reading of the law, the prophets and the writings, the canon, the scriptures can be symbolic of the spoken word of God. Singing of psalms is symbolic of the activity of praising God. We see holiness as well demonstrated through piety, prayers, alms, Sabbath observance, dietary laws. All of these kind of things become symbolic of one's relationship with God. Purity is about defining what reflects God's intended order of the world. And there were different purity groups who emphasized different things to be done in a certain way to indicate that you were respecting God's order. So priests had laws about these things were to be done on these particular days in these particular ways. Pharisees, the Qumran Jews, Zealots, Christians even have them. And so purity issues are about the order of people. There are certain people in place, in the right places. There are certain things that should be done within society. Certain things are sacred. Certain things are taboo. And if you don't want to become insecure, you don't violate these taboos. You respect what is sacred. And by respecting what is sacred, you can remove the threat of judgment. So this gives a little bit of taste of the importance of thinking about how things stand for something else. And so when you read the New Testament, to be kind of alert to, oh, this thing, this practice, this ethical thing, this particular ritual, how are they symbolic of something that is greater or something that these activities stand for?